25 Pawnshop Lifelines. No one talks about anymore. In the 1930s, when banks locked their doors, pawn windows stayed open. Wedding rings, radios, and even bicycles kept families alive. But how did these tiny loans quietly run entire neighborhoods? Let's dig into the forgotten survival tricks that turned pawn shops into Depression-era banks. 25. Wedding rings pawned and redeemed like hidden savings. Rings carried emotion and cash value. During the Depression, pawn shops became temporary vaults. Rings went on Monday to cover groceries and bills, only to be redeemed by Saturday for Sunday church. Some families repeated this cycle for months. A 1932 Chicago pawn ledger showed rings accounted for nearly 20% of all pledges. Husbands often promised wives they'd never lose it, treating the pawn slip like a receipt for love. These transactions weren't just financial, they blended survival with dignity and ritual. 24. Tools pawned at week's start and redeemed after payday. Skilled workers relied on tools, but often pawned them short-term. A carpenter might pawn his drill on Monday for $2, then reclaim it Friday with wages. In Pittsburgh, pawn records reveal saws, hammers, and wrenches among the top 5 pledged items. Families called this working the cycle. The risk was steep. Lose your ticket, and your livelihood disappeared. Yet for many, pawning tools was the only way to bridge gaps between rent day and payday. It was survival by rotation. 23. Radios and clocks became everyday collateral. Radios were the Depression's prized possessions. Yet they cycled through pawn shops constantly. A pawned radio might fetch $3 to $5, enough for groceries. Families scrambled to redeem them before Roosevelt's fireside chats or big boxing matches. Clocks, too, were steady pawns, valuable, portable, and always saleable. By 1935, pawn shops in New York reported nearly 30% of their shelves filled with radios and clocks. For families, pawning them wasn't just about cash. It meant trading away connection, routine, and comfort, even if only temporarily. 22. Interest calculated in nickels taught real-life math. Pawn loans carried simple interest, often 10% per month. A $1 loan cost a dime, and many learned budgeting through this nickel and dime math. Shop receipts listed exact fees, teaching working-class families the cost of time. Diaries show mothers penciling loan math beside grocery lists. Unlike banks' fine print, pawn interest was transparent, if steep. Kids grew up watching parents calculate, if I borrow $5, it's 50 cents to get it back next week. It was arithmetic lessons taught in hardship. 21st. Work tools were sacred, never pawned unless desperate. Some items were considered untouchable, and work tools topped the list. Miners guarded their lamps, mechanics their wrenches, farmers their plows. Pawning them meant risking unemployment. A Pennsylvania miner recalled pawning his pick once and never forgiving himself. That week I ate, but the next I starved. Tools symbolized self-reliance, and pawning them carried a heavy stigma. Families whispered when they saw a man's shovel or sewing machine in a pawn window. It signaled true desperation, not just routine survival. 20. Strong shop relationships earned better loan terms. Pawnbrokers weren't faceless counters. They often knew families by name. Regulars who paid on time sometimes earned small favors, higher appraisals, waived late fees, or an extra week's grace. In 1930s Cleveland, some pawn shops even kept trust ledgers, noting reliable customers. These relationships blurred business and community. A widow might get her husband's watch held an extra month, while another family had their coal money stretched. For those trapped outside banks, pawnbrokers' trust became a quiet but powerful currency. 19. Winter coats turned into survival loans. Heavy wool coats often spent summers in pawnshop back rooms. Families pawned them in April or May, when warm weather arrived, and redeemed them in October before the frost. In New York, during the 1930s, pawnbrokers said coats represented nearly 15% of seasonal pledges. A pawned coat fetched $2 to $4, enough for coal or groceries. People carefully timed redemptions, knowing one cold snap could mean illness. Pawn windows weren't just banks. They acted like seasonal wardrobes tied directly to survival. 18. Musical instruments kept performers afloat. Musicians treated pawn shops like revolving doors. Trumpets, violins, and banjos went in during slow weeks and came back when gigs picked up. In Depression-era Chicago, jazz performers often pawned instruments between shows, sometimes pledging the same horn a dozen times a year. A saxophone might fetch $10, big money when rent averaged $25 a month. These loans kept entertainment alive in hard times, even as artists lived day to day. Pawnbrokers quietly kept local music scenes afloat, one instrument at a time. 17. Bicycles served as quick cash assets for urban workers. For many urban families, bicycles were both transportation and collateral. Pawning a bike for $2 could buy bread and milk for a week. By the 1930s, pawn shops in industrial towns reported steady demand for bikes because they were easy to resell. Yet redemption was critical. Without a bike, many workers couldn't reach factory jobs. Pawn ledgers show cycles being redeemed on Friday evenings, just in time to ride to Saturday shifts. The bicycle symbolized motion, even when finances stood still. 16. Typewriters bridged jobless stretches. Typewriters were lifelines for job seekers. When unemployed, people pawned them for grocery money, then scrambled to redeem them when interviews or freelance typing jobs appeared. In Detroit, pawn shops often held shelves of Underwoods and Royals, fetching $5 to $8 apiece. For clerks and stenographers, pawning a typewriter risked losing employability altogether. Many pawn slips included notes like, "Redeem by Monday, application." Typewriters weren't just machines. They were stepping stones back into the workforce, their presence or absence shaping entire family prospects. 15. Watches passed through generations, and pawn counters' pocket watches weren't just timekeepers, they were heirlooms. A father's gold or silver watch often moved between dresser drawers and pawn windows repeatedly. In Cincinnati during the Depression, pawnbrokers recalled entire cases filled with engraved family watches. A loan might be $3 to $7, depending on the metal, but the emotional value far outweighed the cash. Families frequently reclaimed them just in time for weddings or funerals. Pawn counters became quiet vaults for family history, holding memory and survival side by side. 14. Sewing machines made women's pawn pledges valuable. For many households, the sewing machine was the equivalent of a second paycheck. Pawning it might bring $7 to $10, but reclaiming it meant restoring the ability to mend, tailor, or take in neighborhood sewing jobs. Singer machines were so common that pawn shops kept whole rows of them. In 1931, Baltimore, pawnbrokers estimated 1 in 5 pledges came from women pawning sewing machines. These weren't idle tools. They were breadwinners themselves, linking women's skill with survival in ways banks never recognized. 13. Pawn tickets themselves became tradable paper. The pawn ticket, a small slip of printed paper, sometimes gained value beyond the shop. Desperate borrowers, unable to redeem an item, often sold their ticket to neighbors at a discount, say $2 for a $3 claim. This created an underground market in pawn rights. Police in Philadelphia noted cases of tickets circulating like unofficial currency. For poor communities, a pawn ticket was more than a receipt. It was a gamble, a promise, and occasionally someone else's opportunity. 12. Silverware chests acted like household bank accounts. Middle-class families often had silverware sets tucked away, and when money ran out, spoons and forks trickled into pawn shops piece by piece. A single fork might fetch 25 cents, a knife 40 cents. In New York, during the early 1930s, pawnbrokers reported entire showcases full of mismatched silver, reflecting how families withdrew utensils like cash. Pawn shops became substitute savings banks, with silverware sets slowly melting down into grocery money before being painstakingly reclaimed, sometimes never reassembled again. 11. Baby carriages pawned between children's births. Families with limited space and money often pawned baby carriages when a child outgrew them, reclaiming them years later for the next baby. A sturdy pram could bring in $2 to $3 at pawn, enough to stretch food money for a week. Shop records from Newark in 1934 show dozens of carriages among pledged goods. Pawnbrokers called them rolling savings accounts. These weren't sentimental objects, just another asset to be recycled through pawn counters as families grew and struggled. 10. Pawned Sunday suits preserved pride. Even in grinding poverty, appearance mattered. Men pawned their Sunday suits during the week, then scraped together funds to redeem them in time for church, weddings, or funerals. Suits brought $4 to $6 depending on fabric, sometimes more for wool. A Philadelphia pawnbroker recalled whole racks of black suits, awaiting pickup each Saturday. For working men, reclaiming a suit wasn't vanity. It was dignity, a way to look respectable in front of neighbors, pastors, and potential employers. Pride demanded punctual redemption. 9. Pawnshop jewelry cases mirrored neighborhood fortunes. The glass cases inside pawnshops told the story of a block. In Detroit during 1932, pawnbrokers noted waves of rings and brooches flooding in right after auto plant layoffs. Stores in coal towns often glittered with miners' wives' necklaces, each tagged with a ticket number. Economists studying pawn records could literally map unemployment spikes by how crowded the jewelry shelves became. For customers, those cases weren't just displays. They were painful mirrors of shared struggle and shrinking fortunes. 8. Seasonal pawn cycles followed weather patterns. Pawn shops worked like calendars. Families pawned electric fans each October when cold weather arrived, only to reclaim them during June's heat waves. Blankets and quilts went the opposite way, pledged in summer, redeemed in winter. In Chicago, one pawn shop ledger from 1935 showed predictable cycles: fans in spring, coats in fall. This seasonal rhythm let families wring the most out of limited cash, while treating pawn shops like revolving closets. Even climate dictated when pawn windows stayed busiest. 7. Gold teeth sometimes pulled for pawn value. Hardship reached shocking extremes. Dentists reported poor patients asking to have gold fillings, or teeth pulled just to pawn the scrap. A single gold tooth could fetch $1 or more, enough to feed a family for a couple of days. In 1931, New York, reports surfaced of pawnbrokers melting down dental gold, reselling it by weight. These pledges showed the brutal calculus of survival, where even body parts became currency when cash, credit, and dignity ran out. 6. Pawned pocket knives symbolized scraping by pocket knives, rarely brought more than a dime or two. Yet they were among the most common pledges recorded in small-town shops. For farm boys and laborers, pawning a knife meant surrendering a trusted companion to get through the week. Pawnbrokers in West Virginia recalled drawers filled with simple case and buck knives. Each represented hunger narrowly avoided. Though tiny loans, they spoke volumes. Even the smallest possessions could be monetized when survival demanded every possible penny. 5. Radios redeemed on election nights or big boxing fights families couldn't afford to miss history. Radios pawned for grocery money during the week were rushed back out for Roosevelt's fireside chats, Joe Louis's fights, or election night tallies. Pawnbrokers joked about Friday rushes, when lines of people paid interest just to take radios home for a single evening. In 1936, some New York shops reported radio redemptions, spiking 25% on big fight nights. Radios were more than furniture. They were voices of hope, pride, and connection worth every borrowed dollar. 4. Pawnshop clerks acted as informal bankers. Many pawnbrokers went beyond the ticket. They advanced tiny off-the-books extensions to regulars, quietly waived late fees, or let trusted customers reclaim goods before paying in full. A 1934 survey of New York shops showed nearly 15% of loans were informally extended this way. Clerks knew when a family was honest but strapped, and their flexibility often determined whether groceries or coal made it home. These shopkeepers blurred the line between commerce and community survival. 3. Families rotated pawning among siblings. In multi-sibling households, pawning rotated like clockwork. One brother's suit one week, another's watch the next, so no single person bore the burden alone. Diaries from Appalachian mining families describe detailed pawn rotations to ensure at least one member looked respectable for church or work. This practice also limited risk. If one item was forfeited, another could still be redeemed later. Pawn windows became extensions of family strategy, proof that survival wasn't an individual fight, but a collective balancing act. 2. The pawn counter doubled, as gossip hub lines at pawn shops weren't just about money. They became neighborhood exchanges of news. Waiting customers swapped survival tips, strike updates, and even job rumors. In Chicago's Maxwell Street Pawn District, clerks recalled Saturdays sounding like union halls. Information had value, and the pawn counter became an unofficial bulletin board during the Depression. Families walked away not only with loan slips, but also with fresh knowledge. Where coal was cheaper, which grocer would extend credit, or who was hiring. 1. Pawnshops preserved dignity when banks slammed doors. At the height of the Depression, more than 3 million Americans lived in the scrip or pawn-dependent economies. Banks turned away the working poor, but pawn windows stayed open. A ring, a coat, or a tool could mean food on the table without judgment or shame. Pawnbrokers didn't pry. They handed out tickets. While critics called them exploiters, many families remembered pawn shops as the only banks that would deal with them. For millions, survival and dignity hinged on that small glass window. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed uncovering these forgotten pawn shop survival tricks, hit like and subscribe for more untold history. Stay tuned. Our next videos dive deeper into everyday resilience stories that shaped lives. See you in the next one.